in the Raw, Conversations with Creative People. Tonight, I'm excited to introduce you to my friend Josh. Josh is going to teach us about bonsai, which is essentially living art. If this is your first time watching, thank you. And if this is our first time meeting, you might be wondering who I am. In a nutshell, I'm someone that's been in love with art my entire life. I've now been working in the professional gallery world for 15 years now, and I started art in the Raw as a way to keep people connected and inspired. If that's something you see value in, please do me a solid and like, comment, and subscribe. If you'd like to know a little bit more, please take a look at the description below. But in the meantime, I'm excited to introduce you to Josh. Welcome, Josh.
Well, thank you, Anne. It's a privilege to be on this show. I've seen quite a few of them, and mostly it's working artists. So I'm happy to join you.
We're going to talk about bonsai tonight, which is basically living art.
It's a great description, yeah.
It's something I've been fascinated with for a long time. I've never grown a bonsai tree before. I think I bought one once, and unfortunately, it didn't make it.
That's most people's experience with bonsai. So I started being interested in bonsai when I was working in nurseries, actually in Santa Fe. I think I had maybe one or two that I moved to California with me. And one of those I actually still have today.
I guess I specifically remember you and bonsais in the Bay Area because you had that amazing garden.
Yeah.
With bonsais and other just amazing plants.
Plant collecting kind of became a thing with me. I've been working in nurseries for almost 20 years now. And I think it started off as like sort of a little bit of an obsession where I got one or two and then I wanted more and more. And then eventually I couldn't, it was like if I had to get another one, I had to get rid of one because I didn't have any more space. Being in the Bay Area especially was really inspirational for bonsai because there's such a culture of it there that's not anywhere else that I've ever lived. Just because there's so many Japanese immigrants in the area, there were nurseries that were specifically dedicated to bonsai. You could walk around these grounds and see just the most incredible old bonsais that seemed unattainable. And then they would sell you like little baby ones, little starters. And I just got hooked on buying those little starter plants and starting to train them myself.
It's really fascinating. Like I said, I bought one and it didn't make it, but I was watching some videos about them in preparation to talk to you. And it seems like you can kind of make bonsais from any type of tree as long as you have a general understanding of how it works, and more than anything, it seems like it's just a lot of time and dedication.
Bonsai, it basically just means tree in a pot. So it can be just about anything. And a lot of people think of conifer like a pine or a juniper or something like that, but you can use that bonsai techniques on just about any plant. Most people prefer to do something that's really woody so that you can see like an old trunk kind of look. But I mean, I've seen people do all kinds of weird things. Actually, one that I used to have out in Cali was a bonsai wine grape. Like you said, it's a lot of care. Bonsai is basically they're living on the edge all the time because they're in that tiny tray that basically doesn't allow their roots to get very big. You miss watering it on a hot day and you might lose it like that. It's a horticultural technique, and if you're going to get into it, you don't only want to think of it as an art form. You also have to think of it as the science of plants too. So you kind of have to live in both worlds.
That was something I was kind of curious about because bonsai, it seems like kind of like calligraphy. There's a lot of rules, but then there's the aesthetic rules versus just basic gardening rules. And then there's different, I guess, shapes.
One of the first things that I ran into that really opened up my eyes on how many rules there are was this book by this author named John Naka, who's a famous bonsai guy. I think the book first came out in the 70s. I got my hands on it and I was looking through, and it was like rules for how big how wide the pot's supposed to be in ratios to the size of the tree that's in it. So many set rules. And then of course, very, very specific techniques as as far as the different styles are concerned, right? There's certain things that you're supposed to do as far as where your branches are supposed to start, where they're supposed to taper. I think a lot of it's rooted in the religions that it comes out of. I'm not a spiritual person, really. And so I don't really go down that road with bonsai. But from what I understand, there's a lot of like Taoist and even Buddhist links there. And some of that has to do with those rules. It's interesting to think about. And once I read through all those rules, I realized that I wasn't doing it right. And I never did it right. I continued to do it sort of my way.
In terms of the aesthetics and
I had several that the front has changed from year to year to year. I'll just continually change it, which is kind of actually even more of a living art sort of thing if you think about it, because you're really like developing it at that point instead of just maintaining the specific shape.
Not that I'm an expert in calligraphy, but if, say, for example, you make a character, but you make it backwards, even though it looks the same in the end, just the act of making it backwards makes it wrong. Kind of what you're saying about maybe you didn't maintain your front in the
right. There's also a bunch of rules on branch spacing and stuff. I was just too intimidated, I guess, by all the rules. In a way, I thought it was more fun to do it my way. And going back to me being a plant collector, I think that part of it was more just the fact that I could have more individual plants in small pots, like miniature versions of all the trees that I would want to collect. Like I could have my own little mini arboretum.
And some bonsais are tiny. I was looking at some pictures, and some of them could live in the palm of my hand. I would imagine that type of bonsai would be really challenging to keep alive.
And I think oftentimes those are temporary, but I've seen some really small ones that look like they've been around for a while too. So just a matter of technique, and again, just paying attention and making sure you don't accidentally kill it by letting it go too dry or too wet or all that kind of stuff. But there's also all those techniques of pruning the top as well as pruning the roots, and it all needs to be done at specific times, or you don't get the same kind of reaction that you desire.
I read earlier that sometime in the spring was kind of the ideal time to create one. It is May 20th. Do you think it's too late if I wanted to start one?
No. It would be way too late for me to try to start one in Texas right now. 2 reasons. The spring growth flush is already finished and we are going into the heat now. So you don't really want to be messing around too much at this point in the year around here. There are certain things you could probably still do, but starting one would be tough. I went from probably 40 plus bonsais when I was in the Bay Area to maybe about a half a dozen when I moved here to Texas, mostly because there was no viable way to move them here and keep them alive. And a lot of them weren't going to survive here anyway. They were very much at home in the Bay Area, but wouldn't be so happy here anyway. So I ended up getting rid of so many of them, sold them, actually made quite a bit of money off of that. But I don't do as much as I used to, but I used to do all kinds of things where like I would take it out of the little bonsai pot that it's in and put it into a bigger pot with plenty of space and like let the roots grow and let the top grow so that I could see what would develop out of that. And I could start training whatever new growth was coming out. Because sometimes you don't want to just maintain what you've got. Sometimes you want to experiment with different styles. So that's something that I would do sometimes and that's like something that someone could do if they're thinking of maybe it's too hot in the summertime and I can't be here to water every single day. Maybe it's okay to put it up into a bigger pot for the summer, let it grow a little bit, and then you can kind of work with the training later. For starting them, it's quite common for them to actually allow the roots to grow so that you can develop some trunk before you then kind of take it all back down again, top end, bottom. So that's typically actually, I think, how a lot of folks would start from like a very small starter kind of a plant if you're wanting to develop a trunk, because there's really no way to do that other than letting what they call like the leader or like the main branch grow and actually develop a trunk. And then later you can go back and actually remove that and start working on the branching. And working in the nursery business, you can find a lot of like really like old nursery stock, something that's been sitting for too long and has actually kind of gotten to be something that you can't really sell in the nursery anymore. But if you wanted to and you have the right knowledge and know-how, you could kind of take it and make something out of it. And it's already got like big, thick trunks on it and some gnarly twists and turns. And take the right eye and you look at it, and you might be able to come up with some way to prune out a whole bunch of this other stuff and then come up with a really cool head start kind of bonsai where you've already got like thick, gnarly branches to work with. And then you're just kind of wiring the small branches as they come. So there's that I've also done. I don't know if that's in the rule book at all.
Well, I have to say, whenever I go to nurseries and I see sale tables with plants that are half dead, I'm often tempted to buy them and restore them. And sometimes that works out sometimes better than other times.
Sometimes those plants are on discount for a reason. Yeah.
I would imagine probably most people just go out and just buy it pre-bonsaied.
Mm-hmm.
But the other route is just going out and getting some type of tree and the right tools. What sort of tools would you use?
You end up with an arsenal of tools when you're doing this kind of stuff, and also an arsenal of different things that you mix with soils and making your potting medium, basically. So it's quite interesting. There's a lot of wire involved, and of course you need to have the proper bonsai wire that's soft. It's more malleable, so you can actually, it's not just like copper wire cutters to cut the wire. There's little screens that cover the drainage holes of your pot. Those need to be wired down into the pot. Even before you even start anything, you have to get your little pot and you have to cut out your little screens and make sure that you're covering your drainage holes, and you anchor those in with wire. And then you typically run wire up through those drainage holes. And that's what you tie your whole tree to. So if you had a tree with some roots down here, you put it down into your pot, and then with these two wires that are coming up out of the drain holes, you would start wrapping. And so basically, before you even put soil in the pot, you can take your tree by the trunk, pick it up, and it's attached to the pot. You start mixing soil mix and you start filling in behind it and all that. So just to start one, that's kind of the basics of what you need. Is you need a pot, you need some screen. You can use just regular window screen if you want, but you can buy little sheets of plastic screening. And you need the wire and something to make a good sharp bonsai soil mix out of. Tool wise, I haven't even talked about any of the pruning tools or anything like that, but ply wise, starting from sort of the ground up, that's where you go.
So I've seen people wrapping the wire around the branches to kind of create different shapes. So you're saying it's actually wired into the pot. So
yeah, a lot of times it's actually wired into the pot. You would start with both wires wrapping the trunk, and that way you could start to shape the trunk if you were trying to make like a serpentine shape out of it, or if you were trying to make a cascade bonsai that goes over the edge of the pot. That's where you would start to manipulate the trunk. And oftentimes, if your trunk's thick enough, it's going to take at least two wires coupled together to manipulate that.
And then people usually take them off after a certain period of time.
There's ways to wire so it doesn't cut into the branches. And of course, you end up, I've always just cut it off. Some people actually try to like unwind it and save it and reuse it. And wow. That's too much for me. I just cut it off. That really depends on the plant too. Like how long you can leave wire on certain plants is different from species to species.
So in some of the tool lists, I've seen people had included chopsticks.
Some people use chopsticks as what I usually use is what's called a root hook. And I also have a thing that kind of looks, is kind of a dumb purchase because it's kind of a unitasker and it's basically a butter knife. But that's to go around the edge of the pot when you're taking it out to do root pruning or something like that. So you kind of use the butter knife thing to go around the edge of the pot. Once you pick it up, you've got this massive roots that's just still in the shape of the pot. And if you want to, you need to tease those roots out in order to do root trimming. So you need to use some sort, and I think some people use chopsticks for that. I use a thing that's actually it's like a little metal hook. You just ease the root mass out of that shape, so then you can then do your root trimming.
This is when you're originally potting it, or are you pulling them out later to
Yeah, this is a maintenance thing.
Okay.
Because otherwise what happens is the tree just becomes completely pot bound, which means the roots have just spun up on themselves, and eventually it just chokes itself out. What we do with bonsai is, depending on the genus and the species, certain amounts of time have to go by before you do root trimming. Some things it's every 2 to 3 years. Some things it's every 5 years. Some things, I had one that I was trying to maintain for a long time and successfully did so for a while. That was actually a dwarf variety of weeping willow. And anybody knows anything about willows knows that their roots grow like insanely crazy. So that one actually needed to be root trimmed every 6 months. So kind of depends on the tree, but yeah, in order to maintain that, not only from keeping it from getting root bound, but also to keep it from growing too much, we trim the roots. The more you trim the roots on the bottom, so just like how you would trim a plant on the top, if you trim it, oftentimes it branches out from that cut. So you get 2 new little shoots. The roots do the same thing. And the more little splits that you get on your roots, the more tiny splits of little branches you get on the top as well. So the whole thing works to sort of keep the plant diminutive.
That's amazing. And some bonsai trees, I don't have notes, but there are some that are thousands or more.
I think there are been passed down through generations.
There's a botanic gardens in Portland, typically credited for having the best Japanese garden in the United States, they've said. But they have a bonsai collection, and you can go through and you look at the little plaques, and some of them are thousands of years old. So
yeah,
would you guess the employees there are still pulling those guys out and
absolutely, yeah, it's a huge responsibility, but yeah, I couldn't imagine being tasked with that.
That would scare me to death.
Yeah, seriously, but that's part of it. That's always going to be a part of it, and that's the dedication that's needed to keep some of those around for that long. It is highly respectable. I kind of look at the whole thing, even though I don't practice the kind of reverence that I have for it, I really do have a lot of reverence and respect for the technique, the time, the effort. And I think part of that is because it's so tied up not only in their religion, but also like in their family, in their in their ancestors. That would be scary to me, to have that responsibility of taking care of like there was a Japanese black pine bonsai that survived the Hiroshima bombing.
You don't want to kill that bonsai.
Right. Even like the one that I was talking about that I've had for, I don't know, since probably 2001, something like that. So it's about, well, it's be 20 years, right? You may have seen it on the national news. We had a really bad freeze here in Texas in February, which was a really bad experience for us. We lost our power for like 48 hours and we had no heat, and I was trying to keep things alive that I normally, wouldn't worry too much about, but because we don't normally get that cold around here, I was like, okay, I could move everything into the garage, and I was so afraid that I was going to lose that, even though I know it's okay. I was just so nervous about losing that little plant that I brought it in and actually like kept it inside my bathroom, kept it hidden away from the cats, and was like, okay, you're going to survive in here, and then I'll put you back out as soon as I can, I swear. It made it just fine. But it was like, man, I hope I don't lose this. This is like a friend at this point.
Oh, sure. No, it's been with you that long. So speaking of, I have a Japanese maple that I put in a pot about 9 years ago, and it's not a tiny pot and it's not a tiny tree, but it only is getting so big based upon the pot. Right. I assume. Would that be considered a bonsai, do you think?
If it's a tree in a pot, right? Yeah, you're just not really following any techniques. So yes, loosely, I suppose you could say it is, but I think there are some people that do collectible conifers that are developed. Basically, like, you don't have to touch them and they'll just grow this like really cool shape because they're just sort of hybridized to do that. And like, you could take one of those stick it in a pot that is kind of flat looking, and you could probably get away with saying that's a bonsai. Even though you're not really doing anything, it's keeping itself dwarfed. It's kind of growing in a specific way that it's sort of hybridized to do. So I've seen people do that, and actually I've seen nurseries that sell whole lines of those kinds of plants, and they call them pre-bonsai or something like that. But Japanese maple does make an interesting bonsai. I've seen it done. It's just that it takes quite a bit of time to develop branching and stuff like that.
This particular one's been in the pot for about 9 years, and the pot's starting to crack. So I'm a little terrified what's going to happen when the pot actually just cracks in half.
Well, before it cracks the pot, you can take it out of that pot, do some root trimming, use a little bonsai technique there, trim a little bit on the top. Whenever you trim a little bit on the bottom, you always have to trim a little on the top. You could totally use that technique, put it right back into the same pot. You can refresh the soil. That's one way that you can keep that tree in that pot for a longer time, is by using some bonsai techniques.
So I think it might have actually started, the roots might have started going through the hole in the ground. And like you've seen, plants that do that, where you try to pick up the pot.
Yeah.
It's still a potted plant, but it's in the ground. And I'm always kind of terrified to pull it up.
Honestly, there's always a good time and a bad time to do that kind of stuff. If you got to do major root trimming, like that situation where you might actually have to get like a little saw and like cut the root, you do that in like the late winter time there, but while the tree is really dormant still.
So it can be done.
But it can't be done during active growing season.
And so we should mention, you're now studying environmental and earth science.
I've been working in nurseries for so long, and I decided to go back to school to get a degree that I'd never finished my bachelor's degree at the College of Santa Fe. So I wanted to at least get that. I've been doing horticulture for so long. I think of the backyard as an ecosystem. I can think of the whole world as an ecosystem. So I decided to get into environmental science, and that's what I got my bachelor's of science in after many years of going to school part-time and working full-time and all that. And eventually I switched over to going to school full-time and working part-time. It was just a kind of a natural segue, it seemed like, since I had already learned so much about the science of plants and other things that have to do with plants, climatary factors and things like that. I figured it would be a good thing to get into. Now I've got my bachelor's. I'm actually working on my Ph.D. now.
No, I mean, that makes sense transition wise, and obviously something that has held your attention.
There's something that I've figured out about myself over the years that kind of goes against like what I guess conventionally I was told over many times, especially in high school and early college years, was that people are either like left-brained or right-brained, and you're either going to be creative or you're going to be scientific or something like that. Not only has that been disproven, but it's definitely not true of myself. When we first met, I was playing music a lot. And I think you may remember that part of what I did with my music was I liked to make music, but then I was like way into home recording and sort of like the techie side of it too.
Sure.
So, and I think that also comes into play with bonsai, where, this is art, but it's also science. It's the two things just come together so well, because you can't have just one or the other. You can't be just creative with bonsai without knowing the science behind not only how to grow plants, but how to grow that specific plant, when to prune that specific plant, how to prune it. I mean, it's very scientific. It's also very creative. That's coming up again now in my work as a PhD student. I do mapping. Like I make a lot of maps. And there we go again. Now I'm strictly science, but now I'm starting to get, there's an art form to this too. Making things that communicate your science better to people that you need to communicate it to. So I think that all kind of runs together in that sense. I'm creative, but I'm also scientific. Anyone that lets anyone tell them that they're one-sided or the other should really think twice about that.
No, I think that's absolutely true. And maybe this is obvious, but if you were only pursuing bonsai specifically for the aesthetic side, you probably kill all the bonsai And if you were only pursuing it from the scientific side, you might just have some ugly trees.
Right.
So going both ways, that's where it all comes together. And that's something I'd kind of thought about a little bit more recently, I would say honestly, and just in making this show and in talking to people. Because if you look way, way back, one of the more famous photographers in the history of photography is Anna Atkins, and she was a botanist. A big part of her MO was just trying to record the plants. So she was taking the plants and she was putting them on light sensitive paper, and she was making imagery of them. And in this day and age, they fit both criterias. Her images are considered art, but it's also scientific research. And then there's also Professor Karl Blossfeldt, who was a professor and artist. And in his imagery, he was making his own cameras that were able to magnify plants up to 500 times their actual size. So when you look at the images, they don't look like plants at all. They're architectural, they're beautiful. And he was a German scientist, and there was all, and his book was wildly popular. But if you just popped up one of his pictures and said, "What is this?" you wouldn't know it was a plant.
My dad is and always has been really into birding, and he has all these field guides of birds, and like some of the like old ones that like done by Audubon.
Yeah.
Like those are like scientific field guides that were hand painted individual birds. Pretty incredible.
Art and science were a thing, and then they became kind of disconnected. And
Right. And you know what? I've had professors that have complained about the images in their textbooks and things like that, especially on things like biological processes inside your body, cellular processes. We need better scientific artists, basically, because we're trying to teach, and this cartoon that you've drawn to explain it doesn't really cut it. So I feel like there's been a disconnect there for sure. You look at Da Vinci, who was in everything, scientist, musician, artist, everything all together. And I think we've gotten to a point where we specialize a little too much.
Right, we're gonna put this thing in this box and that one, and it actually doesn't even make sense.
I think it's probably like most weird questions that you can never really find a good answer to. You can always kind of figure out. It's probably has something to do with capitalism, right?
So I don't know if you saw the episode with Matt Cherie, but he does cyanotypes in the Anna Atkins style, which we somehow didn't even actually bring up during the episode. But he also started making birdhouses.
Oh, the birdhouse guy, yeah.
So I have one of his birdhouses now. I'm pretty sure a bird is moving in. There's a finch that I've seen multiple times putting different sticks and other materials in there.
That's cool. I always like to watch birds grow up in the yard. We had blue jays that nested in our backyard this year, which was pretty surprising because normally we see them nest like way at the top of some tree because they're big birds. He was like nesting at like basically about my fence height. So like you could walk up and like you could see the nest, you could see the baby blue jays in there. And of course you had to be careful not to get dive bombed by the blue jays that were like protecting their nest. They did a good job of keeping the squirrels out of the yard.
So blue jays keep the squirrels out.
It was pretty funny. Normally they don't, but because they nested along the fence line, and like the squirrels like to run along the fence line, and every squirrel that went by would get attacked. It was pretty funny.
So I'm curious, given that bonsais, you could choose any type of plant you want to make one. Would you say if you're a beginner and you wanted to make your own bonsai, is there a particular type of tree that you might suggest that might be just a little easier to keep alive?
Sure, yeah, I can. The thing is that before you even think about the type of tree, the first thing you want to know is whether you're doing what I would say is two different things. There's one thing that I call bonsai, and there's another thing that I would call indoor bonsai. There are a lot of plants that you can find on the market that look like, hey, that's a pretty cool little bonsai tree. That's basically like a little ficus tree or a jade succulents or stuff like that. That would really be like more of an indoor plant because it wouldn't survive your winters. And I don't think of those as traditional bonsai plants, although you can you can do that. I actually I had a little ficus tree for a while when I was in California. That was another nursery one where I think it was like a big pot that was used to be a ficus that was like 5 feet tall that had died. And I just like cut the whole thing down to like 6 inches worth of trunk and to see if anything happened. And it happened. Going back to, I think the easiest way to answer that is a juniper. I would say if you can get an opportunity to, there's one called Juniper procumbens nana. I think it's sometimes just called dwarf Japanese garden juniper or something like that, but that's its botanical name is Juniper procumbens nana. You would put that outside somewhere where you get like partial sunlight. That's another thing you got to remember about bonsai is their placement, right? A lot of people think of them as, all right, I'm going to take this thing, I'll put it on this cool little miniature table or something like that I have in my den.
Right.
Or, something like that. And it's like, yeah, sure, that's going to look good for a few days until it starts to die from not having any light. That's part of, I think, why I had so many bonsai. There was a place that I used to love to keep one up on my mantle. Really cool display, right? It looks really great. It's awesome for people that come by and you can talk about it and stuff like that. But you can only really keep most bonsais inside for like maybe a week before they start to go downhill. So I would basically just rotate. I would put one up there, leave it up there for maybe a few days, take it back outside, put another one up there. So you can always do that if you want to have a place in your house where you're featuring a bonsai tree. But just remember that you're never going to be able to keep one on your dining room table or something like that. So you kind of have to have a place for it. That's the right place.
What about outside during the winter?
The junipers are typically one of the hardier trees that are fairly easy to work with bonsai. I'd have to check your zone, but I'm pretty sure I kept my juniper outside year round in Santa Fe, so I don't think you have to worry about that.
So it's more just the planting zone. Is that what they call it?
Yeah, it's what's called your USDA hardiness zone. I think everybody's got a number that gets assigned to them based on how cold it gets there in the winter on average. And then every plant has like a designated zones in which they can grow. So that's always one thing you want to look for if you're thinking about something that you're going to keep outdoors year round, is to make sure that it's within your zone.
Sounds like with bonsai, that's kind of what you're looking for. You couldn't bring it inside for the winter necessarily.
Right. Yeah. No, you don't want to have to put yourself into that situation unless you have an actual greenhouse or a grow room.
Do you have a favorite bonsai that you still have?
It's my juniper, actually. And that's actually the one that I've had that I've had the longest, and I think has changed styles several times. Right now it's a cascade. It started off as just a small, like maybe about this big little juniper, and now it's cascading about, I don't know, maybe about a foot long. So I have a pot that I have up on a little plant stand because the foliage actually goes well beyond where the pot is.
And so in terms of styles, there's the cascade style.
Favorites are the groves. Those are my favorites. I actually have a ginkgo, a grove of ginkgos, 5 or 7, I think it was 7 individual little ginkgo starters that I planted all together in one tray and have been developing that since I lived in California. There are all kinds of style names. I talked earlier about that John Naka book, right? I would say that's like the starting point for anybody that wants to like really know the rules. But if you just want to look at styles and stuff like that, there are like a million little coffee table books of bonsai that aren't, they're not like, they'll give you the basics of how to do things, but they're mostly pictures. They're mostly pretty pictures of really cool bonsais in different styles. There's specific routes you can take. I think it's called Satsuki, which is dealing with nothing but flowering bonsai trees, typically mostly azaleas. The whole point of those is completely different than, say, if you're dealing with a Japanese black pine, which I think is pretty much considered like the standard of upright bonsai plants that are used.
That's an interesting subject. Fruiting bonsai. Is the fruit naturally bonsai'd, or like how does that work?
No, actually, like I've seen crabapple. done at bonsai. And crab apples, they can range in size, but we're talking these things were like tiny. And like if you could produce 2 or 3 little apples on your bonsai tree, then you're successful. So that was my wine grape.
Wow. So the grapes are
So
full
the grapes are
size,
just the regular same size as as they would be.
just the
Just
vine is
yeah,
smaller.
the trunk had gotten pretty cool at that point. It was something I had access to because we sold bare root, what they call bare root grapes. So what we were selling was just this basically like a little bit of a trunk with a little bit of a top and then roots.
Hmm.
And all the rest of this just grew. But you can see that I didn't really wire much on this. And I don't really wire much in general. This is the very beginning of that ginkgo biloba grove. It's
The
kind of like how
grove.
aspens grow up there, where they all grow like they all grow together in like these little families of groves. So that's the idea behind this one. And again, this was barely started at this point.
And you've added some moss, which I
Yeah, the
guess
moss actually just started growing on it. That's California for you. That's the Bay Area.
that wouldn't happen in New Mexico.
No. This was the juniper that I keep talking about. This was many years ago. This is how it looked like then.
Hmm.
And it looks completely different now. Basically, this whole left side is gone, and this right side is now cascaded all the way down.
And that's based upon how you trimmed it,
That's
or
it, both on how I trimmed it and how I wired it. Yeah.
so the wiring can keep happening throughout the process, throughout
Hmm.
its life.
Yeah, there are times where you keep it wired for training. There are other times you just take it off. If you're in a bonsai club or something like that, and you're doing a bonsai show, you wouldn't want your guys to have wires on them for the show. The tree branches, as they grow thicker, the wire cuts into them, and then you have these wire marks on the branches. That's no good. So this is an example of that. That was the ficus tree that I was telling you about. This was probably originally in a pot that was about like 12 inches by 12 inches, and the plant was probably about 3 feet tall. And that's how it was able to have all these big trunks on it when I got it. So I was able to basically take it and like cut it down to maybe, I don't know if this is maybe 8 inches or so, something like that. And then from below my cuts, all this green came. So I was basically able to save a plant that was going to be going in the trash and turned it into that. This is my place in California, the Trident Maple, which is related to Japanese maple. And then you can see all the moss on that ginkgo, right?
Oh yeah.
But this was part of the table that I had set up, which had about 20 to 30 bonsais on this table. I had like a tiered table. Don't have too many pictures of them, unfortunately. And then here's something I mentioned, those dwarf conifers that just sort of grow naturally like bonsai. I didn't do any training on this guy.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah,
This
I
is
just bought it and stuck it in this pot. So there's always that option of finding these cool, what they call dwarf conifers. This happens to be called a Hinoki cypress, but there are a lot of those really cool Hinoki cypress and other dwarf conifers that get sold like that, where you could literally just put it in kind of a bonsai style pot. You're good to go.
right. Whereas a lot of them, people are maybe trimming out a third to two-thirds of the actual
Hmm.
foliage in the process of training it.
Yeah, sometimes up to 90%. You're like really removing almost everything.
Are there people that you know of that have issues with this, like a PETA?
Yeah, right.
You're harming trees, or I mean,
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm just curious. I
I
haven't heard
haven't
of
heard
this.
anything like that. I mean, the only thing that I would say is that I do feel like sometimes what I do, I guess what you're asking is more like manipulation of the plants and like it's like, what are you doing to that poor thing?
Yeah, are people
And
mad about
I
that?
don't know that anybody ever really gets up in arms about that, but I do sometimes think about the sort of appropriation of culture. Like I said earlier, I have so much reverence for it, but at the same time, I sort of bastardize it. And so I do I think I recognize that, and I'm not trying to. The best thing I can say is like Karate Kid about it. That movie really kind of appropriated that culture. One of my first experiences ever seeing anything that related to bonsai was when I was a kid watching Karate Kid, right? But I think that's always something to take into consideration and make sure that you're, always being respectful of the history and the culture that it comes from.
And that history and culture goes, I don't have dates written down,
Yeah,
but
and I don't know dates either.
did it originally start in China and then actually got appropriated by the
From what I
Japanese.
understand, yeah. And I think
Uh,
originally it was just a way to transport plants from one place to another. Back that far back, you were talking about old trade days where people would be coming from like Europe or something to China, and they see something that grows there that doesn't grow in Europe, and here it is in a little pot. Here you go. Your tree in pot, bonsai, right? So I think that's kind of where it started. Most likely it was more of a practical thing, but with so many other things back then, it got tied up with their culture and their spirituality as well. And all those things used to be interconnected with everyone. You think about the indigenous people of North America too. Those things weren't separate. Their religion wasn't different from their agriculture, which wasn't different from their art. It was all together.
well, even beer, IPA specifically, you needed to put the beer in the boat, and when it got from point A to point B, it still needed to be drinkable and taste good.
Things just come out of practicality. And story is Johnny Appleseed and apple cider, and there was a water quality problem, and so why not just drink fermented drinks, because that's healthier than drinking contaminated waters.
So we talked about collecting kind of naturally, and that your desire to create bonsai was out of your desire to collect plants.
I'm not a big possessions person, I guess. Like I don't really buy a lot of stuff. Mostly what I spend a lot of time on are my academics, going to work, and gardening. I do a vegetable garden every year, and I always sort of trying. Maybe that's a little bit of where my collector goes to. Maybe it is plants, but it's just in a different way it used to be. Because now I garden like vegetable gardening, and so every year I do some tomatoes and some peppers, pretty standard stuff. But I always try new varieties. Always looking for something different, something new to try. And then if I find something that I really like or that does particularly well here, I'll grow that one again next year or something. Right now with my research, I feel like all I do is collect academic papers on climate change.
So I am kind of curious though, just in terms of music, do you think there's any connection to that and the bonsai, or just gardening in general? They're different.
They both require a creative and a scientific side, right? So I think that's a big connection there. Otherwise, I feel like music is generally more collaborative and just a single person, like in other arts it's usually just like a single person's vision, whereas when you're a musician and you're working with a band, there might be somebody driving the creative process, but it's very collaborative. So in that sense, I feel like bonsai is not. It's very much an individual thing. You're the chef, you're in charge. There is no collaboration in bonsai. It is common for there to be regional bonsai clubs. That's definitely a thing. And that's a good way to get started on that kind of stuff too, because a lot of times trying to learn from a book or from YouTube is not as good as learning from other people that have experience. You can ever get a chance to really look at some not only finished but works in progress. Being in the nursery business for as long as I was, and I was a buyer for a long time, so I'd go and visit these big wholesale nurseries, or these places where they're basically just producing plants at a massive scale. They would have a section over in the corners. There's their greenhouse where they're developing bonsais, and like you can actually see in progress. That's pretty interesting to see. So if you ever get a chance to talk to somebody who's working with them, or even just guest appearance at a bonsai club meeting or something like that, just getting to see what they're doing, is that the style of the tree and how it's pruned and everything is supposed to tell a story. It's supposed to be like, okay, this tree had been living on the edge of some cliff over in the tent rocks or something like that, and it's the only way it was able to grow is in this crack in the mountainside, and the only place it had to go was down, and so that's why it has this cascade style to it. There are other techniques that say to your lower branches on an upright should be down like this, whereas your new branches near the top should be up like this, because those lower branches have been getting snow on them every winter and they're bending down, and so those older branches should tell that story of every winter being laden with snow. That's the whole idea, right? You're not just, it's not just a particular aesthetic, but it's supposed to tell a story.
Definitely into that. And You have moved away from New Mexico many, many, many years ago. I know you have sources of chili, but if you were in New Mexico, would you go seek out green chili or red chili first?
Green. That's an easy one. There are certain things that I like with the red, but I can't make my own green chili. I can make something that's pretty close to a New Mexico red, but I can't make the green. I just can't do it. I don't have the magic.
And if you could just drop in from the sky and go to one restaurant,
To Santa Fe? Well, I mean, I would have to go breakfast at Horseman's Haven. Maybe not necessarily for the food, but for the combination of the food and the location, Gabriel's.
sometimes the locations,
Yeah.
part of it.
Mm-hmm. And the food's good too.
Just their patio and everything.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I could spend all afternoon out there.
Now, how about traveling? I know I always love to return to New Mexico, but if you could go anywhere in the world, where would you go?
I'd probably, if I could go anywhere in the world, I'd probably go to Naples, Italy. That's where my heritage is. And I've never been even anywhere in Europe at all. That would be my first stop, although I'd love to do more world traveling in general.
And in terms of time travel, if you could go to Naples, past, present, future, what would
Wow, if I could go anywhere, past, present, future. I don't know that I'd go anywhere in the past. Not that nostalgic. I think I might do future. Yeah, future would be kind of cool. I would like to go to Antarctica in 300 years and see if there's any ice left.
right?
I would think that would be interesting.
And then movies. Any favorite recent movies?
Yeah, God, I've been watching more movies and shows over the last year than I probably have ever in my life. I don't know if anything particularly stands out. Movie-wise, I've been watching a ton of documentaries. I mean, just a ton. I think I've watched every documentary at this point. I think I've seen them all. There's one that I particularly like documentary wise, and that's called Kiss the Ground. So people should check that one out. That's like a documentary about how if we change our agricultural practices and actually start treating the soil like the living thing that it is, it can actually sequester carbon and save us from the dangers of climate change. So that one's really interesting. But then as far as like just pure entertainment is concerned, like some of my old time favorite movies, 2001 A Space Odyssey, Goodfellas, Apocalypse Now is one that I always kind of go back to. Blew me away when I was younger. I watched it probably younger than I should have, but it's an assignment in school where I had to read Heart of Darkness, which is what that movie is based on. And it blew me away. I was just like, whoa, this is not just a great movie. This is a movie based on this great book that also blew me away. So that one kind of got me from the very beginning, and I think I've seen it more than just about anything else.
Stuck with you. And
Yeah, although I can pretty much recite all of Goodfellas for you if you'd like.
sure, yeah, go for it. I'm just kidding. That's one of my favorites as well. Amazing. So is there anything about bonsai we didn't talk about that you feel like the people should know?
If you're gonna start and your first instinct might be to buy a preformed junipers, preformed bonsai trees, but I don't have anything wrong with them being preformed, but there are mass marketers out there that produce these things and they ship them all over the country. And if you ever find one that you're thinking about purchasing and there are rocks that are glued into the pot, don't buy that. That tree is going to die. Basically been meant for it to be an impulse buy. It's not intended to be anything besides that. It's, so don't do that. Hopefully you have a local nursery that's close to wherever you live. Sometimes you even find those kinds of things in like Trader Joe's where you'll see like a little bonsai with glued in rocks. And it's like, avoid that. But other than that, I would say just don't be intimidated and don't get discouraged if you fail a couple of times.
Well, thank you, Josh. Thanks
You're
for
welcome.
hanging out and telling us about bonsai.
Yeah, I'm happy to do it. It was kind of fun. I never thought I'd be on Art in the Raw. We all have our things, right?
Like I said, I actually am totally into dispelling the myth that art and science are that separate.
Oh, happy to be here, Anne. I really appreciate you having me.
Absolutely. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for watching Art in the Raw. If you've enjoyed this episode, please like, comment, and subscribe, or just one of those things. Any of those things will make a big difference. Thank you, and have a good night.